Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Google Ads Fraud Actors and You, the fraud actor tracking and countermeasures. I'll eventually learn to speak English. Apparently, it will not be today, but I am fluent in Appalachian American. So, let me make some adjustments here. Okay, so wanted to kind of give you guys a bird's eye view and boots on the ground perspective on a particular actor that Holly and I were very fortunate to get to track down. I will get into introductions here in just a second. So apologies if anybody is here, I guess wave or say hi. But anyway, not used to not having people who can talk to us. Hello. Okay, sorry. It took me a second to process everything. Oh, yes, the background here is actually my hobby. I'll get into that here in a second. So while we're getting rolling, first off, let's start with a standard disclaimer. We are not lawyers. We don't play lawyers on TV. Before you try anything that we describe, please consult your manager, HR, legal, your local FBI field office, and potentially a therapist. You'll need one. All right, with the standard disclaimer out of the way, let's get a quick introduction. My name's Bryan Austin. I'm a threat intelligence analyst at Fifth Third Bank. My specialties are financial fraud and social engineering. In my spare time, I really enjoy building things, doing farm stuff. Yeah, the background behind me is my current project, which is a 1942 Ford 9N that I'm working on restoring. And we've got currently 5 ducks, a rabbit, a cat, and 3 children who I'm pretty sure are a little bit more wild and feral than the animals are. So I'll turn it over to Holly.
Hey, I'm Holly Fox. I'm a senior information security engineer at Fifth Third. Mostly do a lot of kind of software development work for the intel and detection response teams, which I will talk about more in just a few minutes. My background isn't as interesting. It's just my office, but back there I got the chair where my dog is usually set up. I kicked him out for this, but usually like to spend some time hanging out with him. And yeah. That's me.
If it makes you feel any better, Holly, my kids picked the lock to my office earlier. So that was awesome.
I'm glad my dog can't do that.
Give him time.
Right.
So we wanted to introduce you to this activity. So Ivan, the initial detection. So in June of 2020, some abnormal behavior was identified by our fraud team. Customers were reporting to us that there was a strange site that when they looked us up on Google, they found something that looked like us, but it just seemed off. So we were able to track that back. Google Ads were hosting a listing for a page that was not a legitimate one, but it directed users to a very convincing but very fake login page. You can see over on the right where we actually ran the search through the Google search engine. First result that popped up was a false ad. And you can see it right above it. That's a screenshot from one of the original targeted portals. So it looks, at that time, it looked identical to what we have, which is kind of a standard fish kit thing to do. So detect and response team created fake credentials. We call them sentinels, and submitted them to the portals to test response time of the actor, as well as to kind of, get a feeling for what their goals were. The response times were very impressive. Organizationally, this actor proved quite sophisticated. We were getting login attempts within 5 minutes. If we set up a couple of accounts that also had multi-factor authentication, and the actor would actually get the target to enter a contact phone number, and they would social engineer second factor tokens out of them. It was very impressively organized. But immediately on getting to access to the honeypot account, the actor would then build new users and attempt large wire transfers within a couple of days. So the targets were almost exclusive, or were exclusively commercial banking customers. The portal there is only for our commercial clients. And yeah, it was extremely quick. And actually, Steve Bate asked what point we engaged the hosting provider to take the domain down. I'll actually get to that here in just a couple of minutes. And Holly will have some more statistics, which are, statistics are fun. But to track this actor, so the intelligence team, namely me, were brought in to track this actor. They did use the exact same login page, which was copied from the legitimate one, but it had a kind of an unusual string embedded in the HTML. Specifically, it was Zion's Bank. So we were able to kind of pivot off of that and find some other anomalies through URL scan. They also used a peculiar constant post to a PHP file. The PHP file was unreadable, but we were able to do some traffic interception, and it was acting as almost a real-time keylogger. So the posts were about once a second. The actor also used an older version of some of our graphics, and we'll jump back to real quick, and you can see the graphics here for the Fifth Third Direct, the logos, things like that were all pretty universal, but they were using an older version of that because we had since updated it. And all of the domains that the actor was leveraging, the domains that the actor was leveraging were some version of a typo or bisquat of the actual domain name. The detect and response team also found the header from each of the impersonated domains, calling out to some of the legitimate images that were updated. So they were pulling some down in real time. They had downloaded others. And Mr. Bate asked, yes, and it was very time consuming, but we enjoyed it. Hunting this actor was definitely one of the highlights of my year. But the way that we were able to start tracking them, the SSL certificates. So 75% of the domains that they registered were Let's Encrypt certificates. The interesting point in that is since I made this presentation, they've registered about another 24. So that number has substantially gone up, but let's face it, if you work in blue team any length of time, you know that Let's Encrypt is responsible for about 90% of the malicious domains that have SSL on the internet. Now, the hosting was a little bit more interesting. So originally, they were basing it off of one of like 3 hosts, specifically SNEL. But about August, they made a transition from SNEL over to the unified layer host, specifically going through Bluehost. And almost all of the servers were some variant of Apache 2.4.6 running on CentOS with OpenSSL version 1.0.2K FIPS. So we were able to start pulling that information together, and all were hosting some version of PHP. It did evolve over time, but usually it was within one patch module from the original. So we were able to look through this, and you can see over on the right-hand side, one of the other things that they did that we really enjoyed was they took their SSL certificates and would register one SSL certificate for multiple domains. So in the subject alternative name, you can see ExpressB, ExpressG, ExpressJ. All of those were really, really interesting to us because we were able to knock out a ton of infrastructure before it was even taken live, just because they had registered it as an alternative name. So we'll jump forward. But using all of this information, we were able to identify several leased IP addresses running through Bluehost, and were able to pivot to some of the additional targets. We found 65 financial institutions ranging from smaller regional banks all the way to multinational finance groups. And you can see here's a sample of some of the passive DNS that we pulled from them that were registered to those IP addresses. We were able to, really hunt these down. I think since we made this presentation, that number has gone up to about 75. So we were able to identify some additional ones. But we tracked it out through the infrastructure. But there's another aspect that's always very interesting to us, and that is whatever socioeconomic or geographic influences might take place with this actor. So one of the things that we did is we looked at the user registrations correlated against domain and certificate registrations. The domain and certificate registrations happened within a couple minutes of each other, usually less than 2. So we could kind of lump those together. But you can see, based on Greenwich Mean Time, we've got a pretty good little bell curve going on here. Most of the activity happened between 10 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time and 6 p.m., which is a standard 8-hour day. So we were looking at, time zones that this happened, because that looks an awful lot to me, at least, and my poor, pitiful, uneducated self, like a standard workday. So this gave us a good idea of what time zone the actor was actually working in, and that this was most likely highly organized, which we also detected based on the way that they were registering domains, doing the social engineering, and performing the actual fraud attempts. So lots of really interesting data for us that gave us the indication that this was most likely a syndicate-based operation. So another interesting point, and this was one of my favorites, was we were able to do linguistics. So you can see some of the ads that we've got up here. The one there on the left of the screen is actually at the very top, that's the legitimate ad. So Fifth Third Direct gives you the visibility and productivity to manage your company's finances. So, pretty standard English. And then you look, my favorite by far was the one that's highlighted in blue on your screen. Fifth Third Direct. We share finance that we think can help you take better control of your finance. Financial capitalism is similarly underpinned by financiers who are not the holders. So very clearly, this is not a native English speaker. The language is choppy, a lot of heavy use of the word finance. So we started to do this and made a few interesting notes. The ads had a very particular grammar, which is clearly not native English, but the domains themselves also had kind of an unusual lettering pattern. There was very limited use of the letter H, which really struck me as odd, but it comes into use a little bit later. But there was also excessive use of the letter Q. I spoke to someone who is, I will loan you 3 finances, and I will raise you 1 capitalism, Mr. Bishop. So one of the interesting things was we actually spoke with linguists and native speakers of Russian and Bulgarian and some languages through a couple of information sharing groups, which was extremely helpful. And we found out that the heavy use of the prepositions can be indicative of a Slavic-based language using an online translation system. We ran those ads through different translation systems, Babelfish and Google Translate, and when we spoke with the linguist, they actually were able to tell us that the one that came the closest to an actual language that actually made sense was Google Translate. And the 2 points that it made the most sense were Ukrainian and Bulgarian languages. So again, we moved on to like the heavy use of the word finances or financial, as well as the kind of the anomaly of having the word capitalism thrown into the ad. And as Mr. Bishop pointed out, borrowing 3 finances just doesn't sound right. But the way that capitalism is translated from Google Translate in Bulgarian and Ukrainian, it also actually kind of goes into the word capital, which being like finances to raise for an organization. So we were able to kind of narrow that scope just a little bit more based on the time zone as well as the linguistic anomalies. But the most interesting point came with the letter H and the letter Q. So the letter H doesn't necessarily have like a QWERTY corollary on most Cyrillic keyboards. The Latinitsa and the Bulgarian data standard are particular examples of this. And the letter Q is often associated with the Cyrillic letter Ya. So that one finds a lot of heavy use inside of the organization, inside of the language structured around a Slavic base. So all of that being said, led us to a lot of different domains, and we were beginning to really work on taking them down and doing what we could to disrupt this actor's activities. But one of the best points that we came up with was when we brought in Holly and the threat team to help us make our process a little bit more streamlined. And I'll turn it over to her and let her speak on that.
Sweet. Thanks, Brian. So Brian just kind of described a general strategy of how his team tracked these actors. And like you said, doing that manually worked. It was also pretty time consuming and difficult to manage. Didn't really have the sort of coverage or like reliability that our team needed to cover, like you said, so many domains, and able to make sure that we were quickly able to detect and respond to all of those cases. So for us, the answer to that was automation. So by working with Brian and his team, my colleagues and I were able to put together a step-by-step process of how his team was tracking Ivan and transform that into an automated integration with our XDR platform. So that way the time-consuming, mindless parts of investigation could be taken care of in the background, and then the analysts like Brian could instead spend their time and energy on the more important parts of investigation where time is a lot more critical. So in order to automate a process like this, you need a list of steps that you can have your automation program do over and over again, which is just like the basic idea of automation. But when we started, it wasn't really like his team had a really technical cut and dry process for doing their investigations. So to turn their manual workflow into an automated process, my team looked at and picked out the steps that were going to be repeated every time that didn't really require a lot of logic beyond a yes or a no or processing a list of items. And then using that method, we came up with a few concrete steps that could be programmed into a scripted automation that would take care of the mindless stuff so that the analysts don't have to. So here is a rough outline of what those steps are, purely from a process standpoint. So not really thinking about a technical implementation at this point. And in our first step, what we want to do is check for any new activity going on with any of the domains that we want to monitor. So that is assuming that we already have a list of suspicious domains, and I'll talk about that more on the next slide. But still looking at step one, an easy way to check for new domain activity is by taking advantage of certificate transparency to find newly registered certificates for a domain. So if you're not familiar with what certificate transparency is, it's an experimental protocol. It was put into place about a decade ago, and it had the goal of publicly logging all certificate activity done through trusted certificate authorities. So that way, anyone can access and audit those logs and find suspicious activity, or even just find mistakes. But it's really helpful for our use case because there's certificate transparency providers such as cert.sh, which we can use to look up certificates for any domain and see if there's new certificates. And if there are, we can take note of them in this step one. Second, once we have a list of all of our certificates that we want to learn more about, we can reach out again to cert.sh where we can view and download the certificate itself, as well as any relevant metadata. Then in step three, once we have all of the metadata for each certificate, we can compile it into individual alerts that we submit to our XDR system, and then analysts can review that from there. Last up, we just repeat that process over and over again. So that way it doesn't matter what time of day an actor spins up one of these domains or whether analysts are currently available. The automated system is keeping an eye out and will let us know if something does pop up. So with those steps in mind, this diagram walks through the more technical side of how our team implemented our steps of automation. So starting on the left here, we have an initial foundational step, which is gathering our suspicious domains that we want to monitor. So to make this an automatic process, we use a Python program created by my colleague, Ben Flannery, that we actually call the domain generator. We have multiple sources that feed into the domain generator, and it in turn outputs a plain list of domains that we want to use in our next step. In our case, we have two main sources of gathering domains that we want to check on. So first up is just a domain watch list, and that's just a big list of domains that we want to monitor over time. So this is just a static list that's curated by Bryan's team, comprised of either past bad domains or domains generated using tools that cover some of the possible typo or bit squatting that actors might come up with. The second source we have is using the open source Python program called OpenSquat. OpenSquat works by downloading a big list of domains that have been registered in the past day and then checks for any domains that are similar to a list of configured keywords. So in our case, we might use something like fifth third or 5.3. Any of those domains that it found that are similar enough to our keywords are returned as possible suspects. So then what the domain generator does is combine the static watch list and then the results of running OpenSquat into a single list of suspicious domains that we want to track. And that is step one. Then once we have our big list of domains to check out, we move to the second program of the automation, which we call the certificate transparency collector. So as that name kind of implies, it collects information using certificate transparency in order to create alerts. And how that happens is pretty simple. So for each domain in our list that we made, we search cert.sh to see A, if there's any new certificates for that domain at all. And if so, B, we want to see if there's any new certificates from the last time that we checked. So if there are new certificates for that domain, we take note of them using the ID given by cert.sh. Then for each new certificate that we took note of, the certificate collector makes another call to cert.sh, and this time it's downloading the actual certificate file itself. Then with that in hand, we do three things. So first up, we save the certificate's hash and its cert.sh ID to our tracking database, and that just helps us make sure we don't process it again if we look at that domain later. Then we use an additional Python script to parse out X509 metadata from the certificate. So that's stuff like when it was created, the issuer, alternate names, and all of that good stuff. Then last, we combine the certificate, its domain, and all of the other metadata that we just pulled down into a single JSON object, and we submit that to our XDR platform's API. Then after that, we move on and repeat that same process for all of the thousands of domains that we want to check on. Then once all of that data is submitted, that brings us to the final stage of our automation, where we do some final correlation and then finally display an actual alert to the analyst. So some quick background first. Our team uses an open source platform called ACE for our XDR platform, but we call it ICE-T internally, as it says on the slide there. So while ACE is an open source platform, we do a lot of custom work, such as this tracking automation in-house. But like I said a moment ago, after we compile the certificate data into an alert, we submit it to ICE-T. Then once ICE-T gets the alert, it does its own automated correlation and analysis. So that's stuff like pulling out other domains, pulling out IP addresses as observables, as well as rendering the current content of the domain if it's available. Then once all of that is finished, the certificate file, the metadata, and any additional findings are all displayed as an alert to the analyst in the work queue. Unfortunately, I couldn't grab a screenshot of what that looks like to show you guys, but essentially it's just all of the data that the automation found compiled into one big, pretty summary, and then that's where the automation ends. And then the analysts can pick up with the hope that they have all the information they need for their investigation, if not a really big head start. So that's the technical overview. And I know I just went through a lot pretty quickly, but hopefully you can see how this process boils down to a few simple, repeatable tasks. So that said, simple doesn't mean trivial. On this slide, I broke down how the manual workflow stacks up to the automated one that we stood up, and honestly, there's not much competition. So managing the domains to track is really a breeze when it's automated. So that watch list I was talking about that has thousands of domains in it is just stored in GitHub. And then the additional few hundred domains that we generate using OpenSquat is all taken care of by the domain generator. Availability is also a huge gain. So the automation script is running all day, every day. So you pretty much can't beat that amount of coverage, especially compared to a manual workflow, which can only happen during work hours when analysts aren't necessarily focused on more pressing matters. Then looking at the efficiency gains, these are probably the most impressive. So before it would take an analyst around 20 minutes to do the work that the automation does for a single domain. So that would be max 24 domains being checked in a day if the analyst is doing their work for 8 hours straight, which we know that they can't do. Today, the automation is checking over 4,000 domains in a cycle time of 3 hours. So that's about 2.5 seconds per domain. So that pretty much sells itself. And then just to summarize all of those gains into a single convenience factor, the value is really clear. So before, Bryan and his team had the responsibility of generating and managing thousands of suspicious domains, doing the tedious work of looking them up and sorting through the data one by one, and then feeding it into the XDR system. So not a lot of fun doing that. Today, the automation takes care of it all in the background, and then when something pops up, an alert just lands in their work queue with all of the important stuff already provided. And from there, it can be just a few minutes to disposition or figure out what was going on. So with all of that said, I think it's clear how this was honestly a really perfect use case for automation, as well as a huge help for analysts on the day to day. And as Bryan will talk about more on the next slide, the effort to put this into place has really already paid itself off in investigative results.
It helps if you unmute. So again, this is a little bit older information. That number is well over 200 now. So, but in conclusion, we have currently issued over 180 domain takedowns. That number is closer to about 225 at this point. We engaged the provider to answer Mr. Bates' question. He asked when we engaged the hosting provider to take the domain down. We did leverage a threat intelligence platform to issue takedowns. They've been pretty responsive and have done a really good job for us so far. Though that process happens about we usually get that about step 2 or 3. Once we've identified that the domain is malicious and is hosting malicious content attempting to defraud our customers or harvest credentials. Usually we have alerts within about 2 hours. From that point, it's as long as there's an analyst on shift, it's within 15 to 20 minutes, we have analyzed, evaluated, and assessed that this is actually Ivan, this is a threat, and we will issue a takedown within that time frame. Generally, the company that we're working through will respond to us and issue the takedowns. We've automated it, so it's a little bit faster now, but it's generally within about 20 to 30 minutes. They've acknowledged and issued takedowns. Typically, the domain is either flagged or goes offline, and the company is alerted that this is malicious content well within, I'd say, about 8 hours. But so we've really put a hurting on these guys, and all of this cost a specific amount of money and time. Like Holly said, it took about 20 minutes to process each domain, but all of that pales when you go into knowing that you have messed up a bad guy's day and you're costing them epic amounts of time and money. So that's priceless. For everything you need, for everything money can't buy, there's threat intelligence. So all of that being said, we did wrap up a little bit early. So if anybody does have any questions, they're welcome to ask those. So please, any questions, comments, rude gestures, we're welcome to take those on for you. Mr. Bate made the point that sometimes it is a waiting game on hosting providers' actions. And I've issued a half dozen takedowns this week. And the threat intelligence provider has been spectacular for working with us. The hosting provider and registrar, not so much. There is another alternative avenue. You can go through, I use a website called GotFish, which was put out by Swift on Security. They do a really good, or that person has done a spectacular job of assembling reporting investigation tools for a number of different platforms. So when one of these pops up, we fire it off to our intelligence provider, and we also will go through and we report it to Google, Mozilla, Microsoft, some of the bigger players that are acting as root providers for certificate revocation lists and for block lists. So they've done a really great job of that. Michael Walsh said nothing, that playing whack-a-mole must be a huge time suck. And yes, it is. The automation has, Dallas pointed out that, the automation has made it much more manageable. And it's more than just manageable. It's made it possible for us to really keep up with this actor. So by the time they spin up new infrastructure, in less than 2 hours, we have notification and we're able to jump in and issue takedowns, report the domain as phishing. And if they have spun it up, but they haven't started hosting content, we now are able to keep a very close eye on that. So if content does change, we're able to, keep an eye on that. So no, Mr. Walsh, you are not allowed to do that. Holly is ours. We're not going to give her up. Any other questions, comments? Thank you all for having us. So thank you for listening. If you've got any questions that haven't been answered in the presentation that you want to reach out to us privately, feel free to reach out. My email address is there on the screen. The entire threat intelligence team, our mailbox is there. And Holly's team, the detect and response engineering team, is IS External Threat Squad at 53.com. Apologies for catching this a little bit early, but you guys have been a great crowd, and we've really enjoyed it. So,
Thanks everybody for attending.
And yes, it is time for a fresh cup of coffee.
All right.
So we'll turn it over to Mr. Bishop and Mr. Knowlton. I don't know what else we're supposed to do. Just leave.
Just fade to black.
All right. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks again, everybody.